All right, let's jump right in. We're going to talk about something called power sharing. And look, this isn't just some dry political term. For some countries, it's literally the difference between sticking together and, well, falling apart completely. It's that crucial. So, that really gets us to the big question, right? Imagine this. You've got a country packed with different groups, people who speak different languages, who have totally different cultures. How on earth do you keep a place like that from just tearing itself apart? How do you make it work? That's what we're going to unpack today. And to do that, we're going to look at a real-world story, a tale of two democracies, actually, Belgium and Sri Lanka. You've got this small country in Europe and an island nation in South Asia. Both faced this exact same challenge of diversity. But, and this is the fascinating part, they took completely opposite approaches. And the results, well, they couldn't be more different. Okay, so first things first, we've got to set the scene. Before we can get into the decisions they made, you need to understand what was going on under the surface, the conflicts that were brewing in both places. Let's kick things off with Belgium. If you look at the whole country, it seems pretty simple at first glance. You've got a majority of folks, about 59%, who speak Dutch. Then you have the French speakers, making up 40%. Seems straightforward enough, doesn't it? But hold that thought, because things get really, really interesting and complicated when you zoom in on the capital, Brussels. This is where the whole story flips on its head. Check this out. In Brussels, the French speakers, who are the minority in the country as a whole, are actually the huge majority in the capital city, a whopping 80%. And the Dutch speakers, the national majority, they're just a small 20% minority in their own capital. You can just imagine the kind of tricky power dynamics that creates, right? Okay, now let's hop over to Sri Lanka. The situation there was, let's say, a little less complicated demographically. You had a very clear dominant majority, the Sinhala speakers, at 74%, so about 3 out of every 4 people. And then you had a sizable minority of Tamil speakers, around 18%. So here you have it. Both countries are at this major turning point. They're trying to figure out how to build a modern nation, but they have these deep, deep divisions. They had a huge choice to make. How are we going to run this place so it doesn't fall apart? Sri Lanka went down a path called majoritarianism, and the name kind of gives it away, right? It's this belief that the majority community should be able to rule however it wants, basically without worrying about what the minority wants or needs. And that's exactly the road Sri Lanka started down after it became independent in 1948. And they didn't waste any time putting this idea into practice. In 1956, bam, an act was passed that made Sinhala the only official language. Just like that, Tamil was pushed aside. Then came policies that favored Sinhala speakers for getting into university and landing government jobs. On top of all that, the government started actively promoting Buddhism, the religion of the majority. So you can imagine how the Tamil community felt. They were completely alienated, pushed to the margins. They felt like none of the big political parties gave a hoot about their culture or their language. It felt like their rights were just being stripped away one by one. And here's the bottom line. This path did not lead to a peaceful, unified country. Not at all. The tension just kept building and building until it finally erupted into a brutal, devastating civil war. We're talking decades of conflict. Thousands and thousands of lives lost. A terrible tragedy that only ended in 2009. Okay, so that's a pretty grim story. Now, let's rewind and go back to Belgium. They had their own serious tensions, but they looked at their situation and chose a totally different way forward. They chose the path of accommodation. And when I say they chose it, I mean they really committed to it. This wasn't a one-and-done deal. Get this. Between 1970 and 1993, they amended their constitution 4 times. Think about that. They kept tweaking and adjusting and working at it until they found a setup that everyone, Dutch speakers, French speakers, could actually live with. Now that's putting in the work. And the system they came up with is pretty genius, actually. It's got a few key parts. First, at the national level, the central government has to have an equal number of Dutch and French-speaking ministers. Simple, right? No one's side can just run away with the show. Second, a lot of power was handed down to state governments so they can manage their own affairs. Third, Brussels, the tricky capital, got its own special government with, you guessed it, equal representation. And finally, and this is super clever, they created this third type of government called a community government to deal with stuff like culture, language, and education for each group. So what was the result of all this complicated work? Well, it's not perfect, and Belgian politics can still be messy. But here's the key. They've kept the peace. They avoided the kind of civil war that tore Sri Lanka apart. They found a way to stay united and stable. What a difference, huh? Okay, so we've seen these two very different stories play out. So what's the big takeaway here? What's the lesson? Why is this idea of sharing power so incredibly important? Well, you can basically break it down into two big reasons. The first one is just practical. It's the smart thing to do. Sharing power helps stop groups from fighting each other. It keeps things stable. It prevents chaos. Pretty straightforward. But there's also a deeper, moral reason. Power sharing is really the heart and soul of what democracy is supposed to be. I mean, the whole point of democracy is that everyone affected by the rules should have a say in making them, not just the people in the majority. All right, so we get why it's important. But how do you actually do it? What does it look like in the real world? Let's quickly run through the different ways power can be shared. Okay, first up is something called horizontal distribution. Think of it like a three-legged stool. You've got the legislature, which makes the laws, the executive, which carries them out, and the judiciary, which makes sure the laws are fair. Each leg checks the power of the others, so the whole thing stays balanced and no single part gets too powerful. Next, you have vertical distribution. If horizontal is side by side, vertical is top to bottom. You have the big national government for the whole country, and then you have smaller state or regional governments underneath it. Each level has its own set of responsibilities. You've probably heard of this before. It's often called federalism. But it's not just about the formal structure of government. Power gets shared in other ways too. You can share it among different social groups. Remember Belgium's community government? That's a perfect example. And you see it all the time with political parties. Sometimes no single party wins a majority, so they have to team up in a coalition to govern. Even interest groups, like unions or environmental activists, they all have a piece of the power pie by influencing how decisions get made. So, if you wanted to boil this whole thing down to a simple equation, here it is. When you distribute power fairly, you create a system that's more inclusive for everybody. And that inclusivity is what leads to real, lasting stability. It's as simple as that. And that's where we'll leave it. The stories of Belgium and Sri Lanka really spell it out for us, don't they? But let's be real. This stuff is hard. It's not easy to get this balance right. So the question I want to leave you with is this. When you look around at the world today, with all of its own conflicts and divisions, what do you think are the biggest challenges standing in the way of making power sharing a reality? Something to think about. Thanks so much for tuning in.